I'm Peter Schwartz. I'm a very good friend, colleague, collaborator of Richard, and he is actually the most awesome person in Salesforce. But it is true that I am the oldest guy in the company, and I love the irony: the oldest guy is in charge of the future, right? Well, if you think about it, right, I've got the shortest future in front of me, so I take every day really seriously. It really matters to me. You know, I got to deliver now. As Richard mentioned, something I do is something called scenario planning, thinking about the future in different possible scenarios. And a number of years ago, in the old days of TED, before the new TED, when it was still in Monterey and run by a guy named Richard Socher, and one or two of you are old enough to have been there in those days, I gave a TED talk about the 4 questions for the future. And what they really are is a tool for thinking. They're not, I don't know the answers to these 4 questions, but they are questions you want to keep asking about what's going on, and you'll see that they kind of help structure our thinking about understanding what's going on in the world and where it's headed, what the possible future scenarios. I've been doing this since 1972. I started my career at Stanford Research Institute just down the hill here. I was one of the first 1,000 people online. I actually go back to the ARPANET. That's true. In fact, a hack I did in the early days led to the, one of the things I do is help write movies, and some of you may have seen my first film called War Games. Yeah, so actually Matthew played me. That was actually me in the film. So that, I have seen all of this develop over time. And the tools, what I realized very early on in my career was that when I had started out to say, I want to find better answers for the future. But that turned out to be the wrong question. The right question is, how do I give tools for people to find their own answers for the future? That is, for them to be able to think. So that's what you're going to get today, is a set of tools to think about the future more thoughtfully. And I will update my thinking from the TED Talk, because those same questions apply today, and we've now well over a decade, and much has happened since then, and quite relevant to those 4 questions. Also, back in about 1994, with a number of friends, I also helped start something called Wired magazine, which some of you will have read. And in '97, we published a cover story called The Long Boom, about the impact of technology and globalization on the world. Well, there have been a number of developments in that respect, and I'll also touch on what has happened to the long boom as a result. Okay, so that's it. So there are basically 4 domains I'm going to touch on, and the first is geopolitics, you know, what's going on at a geopolitical level. And there's one big thing that is simply the biggest thing happening in the world in probably this half century, which is the rise of China. It is hard to overestimate how big a deal it is for 1 billion people to come out into the world as modern participants in the world, and for one of the oldest nations on the planet to kind of revive itself. It has been basically semi-dormant for half a millennium, since the rise of colonialism, since it turned its back on technology and so on. And it is now a completely different force in the world. And the impact of the rise of China on the planet, on the United States, etc., is hard to overestimate. It is, in fact, becoming a new global hegemon. Many of us, myself, one of my books is called China's Futures, which we wrote in the 1990s. And many of us had hoped that as China modernized, it would become more like, frankly, Western nations, more open, transparent, and somewhat democratic. That hope has not been realized. It has become a capitalist authoritarian society. Another movie I helped write a number of years ago was a film called Minority Report. And so my team and I created everything you saw on screen in that film. And we got 2 things wrong about Minority Report. First of all, the date. We put it in 2050, it was actually 2020. And the other thing was the location. We put it in Washington, it was actually Beijing. Beijing, how many of you saw Minority Report? Yeah, right. Well, so it is the surveillance society, right? It is exactly what we put on screen, is actually now playing out in Beijing. So this is really an enormous force in the world. The second is the fragmentation of Europe. Only a few years ago, we were, as the euro was born, we were thinking about the United States of Europe, all these new nations coming, these nations coming together in a kind of more integrated political framework as well as an economic framework. Well, that has clearly broken down. I mean, Brexit is an obvious example, but literally today in Paris, where the yellow vests are back out there saying, oh, why spend this money on Notre Dame, when you have all these poor people? We have what's happening in Italy, Poland, Hungary, etc. That vision of Europe coming together in a kind of much more integrated fashion seems to be fragmenting. Though I will say this, I gave this talk recently, and a very prominent German sociologist came up to me. Woodson, I didn't see you there. Hi. Came up to me and said, you've got this wrong. The center is holding. So maybe I'm wrong, but there's an uncertainty here. So that's the second one. And the third is the obvious move to the U.S. to become much more unilateralist and anti-globalist. And that is not Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a symptom. This has been underway for many, many years as the U.S. has been pulling back from the role of international institutions. It really goes back to the Reagan era and somewhat later. The United States has not ratified a treaty in over 40 years, even treaties we write. We wrote a treaty based on the ADA Act, the Americans with Disability Act, right? We got 140 nations to sign it, and then we wouldn't ratify it, right? They rewrote the law of the seas for Ronald Reagan. We wouldn't ratify it. So basically, we've pulled back from the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the BIS, NATO now. That system of institutions that the US and Britain built after World War II that led to peace and prosperity for a better part of a half century is now unraveling, driven in part by the US, not by the forces out there in the world. So we have now this situation where we had a very stable global system. And the fundamental question is the one that was posed very well by a recent book by Graham Allison on the Thucydides trap. Now, I don't know how many of you were students of Greek and Roman literature, but Thucydides made the argument that Athens would inevitably have to go to war against any rising power, that they would ultimately have to defeat Sparta and others. And in fact, was proven right. And so the argument is being made that today we, in the United States, as the dominant power, will inevitably go to war with the rising power of China. Allison is one of the most prominent political scientists in the field and very adept. And any of you who may have read about 2 weeks ago in the New York Times an obit for a guy named Andy Marshall. And Andy was the chief strategist of the Pentagon from 1972 to about 2 years ago. He just died at 97. He retired at almost 95. I worked with him for many, many years, and he too believed that inevitably war with with China was inevitable. So this is, I think, question number one: is are we going to see a war between the United States and China? This is the worst possible outcome of the next 20, 30, 40 years, right? And you can imagine how it might happen. It could be an accident. It starts accidentally. Ships go bump in the night in the South China Sea where the Chinese are pressing and we're trying to keep the lanes open. Taiwan, lots of ways that Taiwan could lead to conflicts. My good friend Kishore Mahbubani argues it's actually India. India and China are going to get at each other and we're going to come down on India's side and it'll be a really big Asian war, the first one ever of that sort. So there are a variety of scenarios for it. So the question you need to be looking out there is, what are the signs that we are moving toward a more equitable relationship or a relationship of conflict? Right now, it's an open question. I'll come back to that when we get to the answers to these questions. Okay, that's question one, war and peace. Second question is economic growth, prosperity. That is, are we going to see sustained economic growth over the next 20, 30 years to lift even the next couple of billion people out of poverty, right? Because you think about what's happened over the last, say, 50, 60 years. In the post-war era, say roughly World War II to 1975, most of the Western nations climbed out of poverty. Europe, US, Japan. We created a vast middle class with a huge manufacturing economy driven by physical technologies. And we built steel, cars, infrastructure, homes, construction industry, all that sort of stuff. And we also had fairly low resource prices in that time, particularly things like energy and oil and gas, etc. Then roughly 75 to 80, things began to change. And we had much more volatile growth, higher inflation, globalization spread jobs around the world. Most of the growth was now in the services industry and driven by IT, very different set of technologies, different set of capabilities. And of course now oil and resource prices in general were much higher as a result. So very different environment. So to look ahead, when you understand that history, you ask yourself, well, what really drives growth and prosperity? Well, first of all, more and better workers, right? More people doing more stuff. Better technology, making those workers more productive. And that's what's happened over time. So more people working more productively leads to more growth. It's not much more complicated than that. However, we then have to ask the question, more people. Well, you guys aren't doing your job. Sorry. Let me take that. Yeah, let's look around. How many of you have children? How many of you have 2 children? 3? 4? 5? Right, okay. There's the answer. The population isn't being born that is going to go to school and go to work and consume tomorrow. That is what has happened. You are typical of the world. We have seen a collapse of population growth worldwide. In the West, first of all, in the US, in Europe, in Japan. You want to see the future? You walk down to Ginza in Tokyo. And what you see is about a quarter of the population is over 65. Japan retired. And they're living off their earnings abroad. No, it's true. They make more money on foreign earnings than on exports already, right? They invested well. They're a retired country. Well, we're on our way here too. But there's a real downside risk. We can even see it fall further. I mean, you look at what's happened in Southeast Asia, the population growth has fallen. China, India, it's falling. Parts of Africa, it's falling, so on. So we don't have a population problem rising. We have a population problem falling. Not enough workers, not enough consumers. And in fact, there's more downside risk because the truth is we haven't yet, many of you are still of childbearing age, you women. And I won't ask, but 10 to 1, at least 25 to 30% of you won't have any kids. Not for any biological, physical reason. You're just going to make career choices like that. That was not true in a previous generation. You didn't. And very few of you will have more than 1 or 2. And so if you think about the fertility rates in the world, we're seeing a rather dramatic drop everywhere. And it's being driven, frankly, by women changing with the role of women in society. So you look around the world, all over the world, that's happening. That's what's really driving it, is that women are taking control of their lives. And I don't want to be a mother of 7 kids and be locked in my house. It's true. So well, but it's women are making a different choice in life. And as a result, our population growth rate. Now, there's an upside to that. The ecological impact of the world is much less. All of those kinds of things are good. That's what we hoped would happen, so the population bomb would go bust. Well, it has. And so we're now in this world of declining population growth. Okay. In fact, that's right, I forgot. We hit a really remarkable threshold only a few weeks ago in the world. There are now more people over 65 than under 5. Yeah, more people like me than children. And it's really quite remarkable. I mean, this is a historic shift of just immense proportions that respect. And it tells you why we need immigration. My good friend over here, Woodson Martin from Salesforce, is one of those people who is heroically helping to deal with the crisis on our border. And is a very dear friend, and you should support everything that he's doing. But we need the immigrants that are being stopped at our border. We need them in our country. Every rich country in the world needs immigrants, frankly. And the Europeans are idiots about this. We're idiots. The Japanese aren't even on the board. They won't accept them at all. So let's be clear. So this is one of the big issues going forward, immigration. Okay, so if economic growth is a product of rising number of people and new technology, well, we've taken one factor off the table, rising population. Second, what about technology? Well, this becomes very important. Now, there's a big argument going on. There's a dreadful book by a professor from Northwestern, Robert Gordon, on growth in America, in which he basically argues that technology is over, right? We've invented everything worth inventing. Well, true, yeah, we did electricity, plumbing, water, cars, airplanes. What's left, right? And so therefore, you can't count on technology to drive growth in the future, right? Well, he's an idiot. He's totally wrong. It fails to understand entirely how science and technology evolves over time. Think about the semiconductor right here in the neighborhood, right? So the semiconductor was born down the hill, mostly. University of Texas might say otherwise, but having said that, right here in the neighborhood. But where did it begin? It didn't begin here. It began in Denmark and Germany in around 1910 to 1925 with the birth of quantum theory. because you needed quantum theory to get to solid-state physics. And in 1947, and in fact, I've actually seen this slide myself, at Bell Labs, they presented a slide to the leadership that said, it may sound like science fiction, but we will soon be able to build solid-state electronic devices. That was 1947, 30 years after they figured out quantum theory. 30 years after that, in 1974, Intel introduces the 8080 chip and the world changes, right? It's still another decade before all that change is felt. But we're talking over a half century from the idea of quantum theory, where nobody was thinking semiconductors, to actually transforming the world with microchips. That's the time frames that are necessary. So you ask yourself the question, can we see things going on in science today? 10 minutes more, okay, no problem. We're almost there. If you look around the world, do you see the science that will create the technology of tomorrow? And the answer is unequivocally yes. I mean, first of all, we are already in the world of building digital assistants for everybody, right? The BlackBerry was to this what Alexa, Amazon, and Google Home want to be to the digital assistant that everybody will have within a few years, making people much more productive. Richard is driving our efforts in that respect. Then you think about two other scientific developments. CRISPR. Right? You all know what CRISPR is, a new form of genetic engineering. Suddenly we are the masters of our own evolution. And you start thinking about what's going to happen in the future of biology. It's quite profound, both on human life, on agriculture, on materials, etc. 2 years ago, we detected for the first time gravity waves. Now, if you think about the physics here, back roughly around 1820 to 1840, we figured out electricity and magnetism and came up with the electromagnetic spectrum. 20 or 30 years later, we're making electric motors, light bulbs, etc. Right? Now, I'm not arguing we're just around the corner for being able to make flying cars, but we've taken the first step toward what will eventually lead to the control of gravity. Now, that's not 10 years, 20 years, it's maybe 50 years. But by the end of the century, we may actually control gravity. And you start thinking what that might mean. So all I'm suggesting is we can already see really profound leaps in science that will create the technology of tomorrow. So I think Gordon is totally wrong. So the real question is, will this actually be sufficient to drive growth, and where will that growth happen? Because it is technology-driven growth continuing, as opposed to population-driven growth. So that's question number 2. Growth. Will we have sustained economic growth? Question number 3 is the equity question. Will that growth be equitable, right? Will everybody get to participate? Will rising tide lift all boats? And that's really quite fundamental. In the 50 to 75 era, it really worked. Everybody rose. In China, over the last 25 years, it really has worked. But it has slowed down in the West, particularly in the United States. Here in the US, it's basically almost all the money goes to the top now. So the real question is, what can we do to change that? How does that evolve? And to understand that, it's been driven by globalization, it's been driven by the shift to services, by changes in taxes, by weak labor, talent. All of you are in enormous demand. This is a room full of very talented people, right? The demand for your services and time is enormous. You will get a disproportionate share of the resources because you generate a disproportionate share of the return. That's the way it is working today. But it means that an awful lot of people are being left behind. We've also cut taxes. And so that means public services have diminished, public education, infrastructure, all that kind of stuff. We've seen a decline in mobility. And now we have the new technology that the risk and the fear that everybody has is that AI is going to put everybody out of work, which I think is a complete failure of imagination. That is, we're going to have essentially AI and people, augmented intelligence working together, robots and people collaborating. So I don't worry. We're going to have a disruption that comes from that. So education is the really key issue here. Are we actually going to be able to re-educate the labor force of tomorrow? And look, the challenge is, I think we're going to have remote driving trucks, for example. So the key skill is Grand Theft Auto, right? But that 60-year-old truck driver who never grew up playing Grand Theft Auto may have trouble with that transition. And that's the real question, is can we get him on board? So that's the third question, is who gets those jobs? How do those rewards get distributed? Are we going to see a more equitable society rather than a less equitable society? So that's question 3, equity. Question 4 is sustainability. Can we have a high growth, high sustainable, peaceful world that is also sustainable? What's the eco-impact of growth? We are today in the Anthropocene. We've been there for about 10,000 years, ever since we really settled down and started cutting down forests and doing agriculture and all that. We are the biggest force changing the world. And you can look at all of the ecological impacts really through one lens, and that is climate change. I actually helped lead the first large-scale climate assessment here at SRI back in 1977. We were looking at it already then. We are in an era of climate change. that is already happening, right? Everything that we see around us tells us that. The question is, can we slow it down and can we change the trajectory? I represented Salesforce at the climate talks a couple of years ago in Paris. And all we did there was talk about going from this growth rate of greenhouse gases to this growth rate of greenhouse gases. We need to go down here. Very good book came out here in the Bay Area recently called Drawdown, on strategies for actually drawing down CO2. That will happen. I'm actually quite confident. Climate change is inevitable, but I believe that the technologies we need, including new forms of nuclear power, I think are very likely, including really huge improvements in efficiency, whether it's electric vehicles, new buildings, new city designs, and so on. So I'm reasonably optimistic about our ability to do that. But that becomes, and if you look at what's going on in places like China, they are moving incredibly fast on many of these issues, whether it's renewables or pollution and so on. So I'm actually moderately optimistic about that. So that's the fourth question, sustainability. Is that growth sustainable? So those are basically the four fundamental questions. They are peace, growth, peace, prosperity, equity, and sustainability. And so that leads you to these four questions. Is the world more stable and open with no major conflicts? Is economic growth reliable and robust? Is economic growth more equitable? And is the growth ecologically sustainable? And if the answer to all four of those questions is yes, we've got a great future, great scenario, right? Then we can deal with many other issues, human rights and many other issues that basically those don't deal with directly but create the context for. A world where we are actually stable, peaceful, and ecologically sustainable is a world that is actually likely to deal with many other issues. If any of the answers to those questions is no, we got some big issues. And if the answer to all four is no, we're really screwed. It is the world of 1914 to 1945. That's the all no scenario. So the scenario we really want to see is, of course, the all yes scenario. And if I look back over the last decade since I gave this talk originally, well, if you look at the US-China situation, it's gotten a bit dicier than then. But, you know, a very odd thing has happened in the last few weeks. You might imagine I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, and, to say the least. Having said that, in an odd sort of way, he may have gotten China right. That is that there's now a move on the left and the right aligning and trying to contain some of what have been China's not so great impulses in recent years. Europe is joining the fight. And even inside China, now some dissidents are beginning to speak up that this might actually get Xi Jinping to begin to change his policies. I'm still skeptical, but there's at least a chance that maybe he's getting it right. It's hard for me to imagine, but maybe he's getting it right. On the growth side, despite an economic crisis, we've done actually reasonably well. It goes up and down, but we're doing reasonably well. On the equity, not so good in the US, much better in places like China. And with respect to sustainability, actually we've made a fair amount of progress. A lot of renewables, a lot more efficiency, lots of new kinds of technologies. So I'm reasonably optimistic. So having said all of that, I just conclude by saying, look, the answer to all four of those questions is not arbitrary and historical. They're in your hands. War and peace, growth, prosperity, equity, sustainability are all human choices. These are not things that nature gives us. These are choices that we make ourselves. So, you know, I was born in a refugee camp in 1946. Today, I'm reasonably well off and near the top of one of the great companies in the world. When I look at that progress, I can be only optimistic. And I think history is on the side of the optimists. Thank you.